We had begun to discuss the career of Leonardo da Vinci, one of the great artists of the High Renaissance in Italy, and we had seen how in 1482 he had moved from his hometown of Florence, where he began his career, to the city of Milan, where he had answered the call from Duke Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, who needed a court painter, and Leonardo had applied for the job, sort of sold himself as a man of all trades, but also a painter, and began to work for the Duke on various projects that he had lined up. And the Madonna of the Rocks on the right is one of these projects. It was painted for a religious brotherhood that the Duke belonged to, as we talked in class, that was devoted to the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, the idea that the Virgin Mary was born of a virgin herself. And Leonardo envisions this or conceptualizes it as the Virgin sort of enshrouded in nature, kind of emerging from nature. And we see all of Leonardo's hallmark effects in the work. Many of his most famous works were done while in Milan, working for the Duke of Milan, Duke Ludovico Sforza. The Last Supper, the famous Last Supper, was done for a monastery that Sforza supported monetarily, that he had established. And this is another in a long series of such commissions that we saw, starting with Duke Philip the Bold of Burgundy. We saw it also with Cosimo de' Medici, the idea of a confraternity, a monastery helping to pray for your salvation and a good work that can be used for your salvation. In 1498, the city of Milan was attacked by troops coming from France, crossing the Alps into Milan, and was actually overthrown by the French king. At this point, Leonardo da Vinci returns to his hometown of Florence. This is in 1498, where he sets up shop for more or less the next 10 years, living in Florence. And it's there that he paints the Mona Lisa, one of the most famous works in all of the world. This is a simple, straightforward Renaissance portrait. She was the wife of a wealthy merchant named Gherardini, Lisa Maria Gherardini, and the title Mona Lisa simply means Lady Lisa. Mona is in Italian similar to Madam in English or in French, or Ma'am in English. Lady Lisa, Madam Lisa. For some reason, Leonardo kept it. We don't know why. He kept it up until his death. It remained in his possession. Some people speculate that he didn't finish it until later, that he never gave it to them excuse me, because it was unfinished. There certainly was nothing romantic between Leonardo and Lisa Maria Gherardini. Leonardo preferred the company of men, so that's certainly not the case. But that's one of the mysteries that surrounds the Mona Lisa, is that he kept it for reasons unknown. If we look back to his early portrait of Ginevra de' Benci from the National Gallery that we saw before, you'll notice how similar the layout is, and in fact the Mona Lisa is one of the reasons that we think that Ginevra de' Benci would have been shown with her hands as part of her portrait, because the hands are so eloquent. The hands do, in fact, add something to the character. Now, Leonardo and other portraitists understand this. It was also just the norm for Renaissance portraits, and that's certainly what he's done here. He depicts Lisa on the balustrade of Palazzo, we think, seated in a side chair. The Palazzo overlooks this massive landscape vista that really shows Leonardo's trademark use of smoky light that we've really seen anywhere. And indeed, if we look at Mona Lisa compared to Ginevra de' Benci, you can see that the smokiness has gotten more smoky. In fact, significant portions of the landscape, even her clothing and face, just sort of drift into the haze or seem to emerge from the haze. And on a certain level, when we begin to look at it, we start to see forms meld with other forms. Water turns into stone. The curls of her hair turn into rolls of fabric. impossible sort of to read anything below the waist. And so this sfumato that we've become so accustomed with Leonardo's works, again, cloud things. They make it so that you have to try to understand it in your mind. Maybe you, the viewer, complete the painting. That really its completion only exists inside your own head. And I think that Leonardo liked this idea. We think that a lot of Renaissance artists like this idea of leaving something unfinished so the viewer completes it, because it fits with Platonic ideas about where perfection lies. Perfection doesn't lie in the physical world. Perfection only lies in ideals, and Leonardo adds to that with his sfumato. It's really everywhere. It's in her figure. There are areas that are picked out with great detail. The embroidery, for example, on her bodice. But you'll notice how her hair emerges gently from the shadows and sort of cascades over her breast. But as it moves back into the shadow, it sort of melds into part of her costume over her shoulder, or into that gauzy piece of fabric that she has in her hair that barely comes over the top of her forehead. And as we look even more closely at her face, we see that the sfumato is even there. That, in fact, there isn't much in the way of a good sharp line anywhere in her face. If you look at her lips, for example, the edge of her lips is a blur as it moves from the color of the lips to the color of her cheeks. Even the line that separates her upper lip from the lower lip, it follows the standard lip line, but at the same time, it's not really a line. It's, again, a blur. The edges of her eyelids, the sides of her nose. In fact, there really aren't distinctions to the sides of her nose. They really does. More things blend together than separate apart. And I think this is part of her mystery as well. Why her expression is so hard to read is because Leonardo has used this sfumato lighting, this smoky light, to blur things, to make them less set in stone and more open to interpretation. And I think that's part of the allure of this picture over the centuries. As we look at the background, we find that it is significantly more sophisticated than the simple use of a plant that bears the sitter's name, as it was with Ginevra da Benci. And here we see clouds rolling over these Leonardo-like rocks that seem to erupt from the ground, fog shrouding the base of them. And then as we move through, those rocks seem to sort of transform and become a river that runs underneath a bridge, coming forward to the front of the canvas. Leonardo was, throughout his entire life, deeply interested in nature, and particularly those moments when nature is in flux, when things are changing, and how the power of nature can roll over mountains and erupt onto towns. This wonderful red chalk drawing. Rain and fog seem to absolutely enthrall Leonardo, because he had to keep watching it. He had to keep investigating it, because every time he looked away, when he looked back, it would have changed. And I think that his paintings try to capture that idea, that nature is always changing, in the same way that he tried to capture it through his drawings. He was particularly interested in the movements of water, how water might be deflected, how water swirled when it landed in a pool from a conduit, and he wrote about this. Leonardo was left-handed, so all of his notations are backwards, and that's not because he was trying to hide anything. He wasn't publishing these anyway. It's only that if he wrote the way that right-handers pen their words, the heel of his hand would have smeared the wet ink from his fountain pen. And so he wrote backwards. It's just a simple solution to an old problem. Any left-hander, if you watch them write, usually write with their hand in a very strangely contorted position, simply to not smear the ink. For Leonardo, it was just easier to write backwards and learn how to read this stuff backwards without using a mirror or anything. What I've always found fascinating is the fact that Leonardo seems to think that everything is like water. Things swirl like the waves and the eddies produced by those blockages introduced into the current in the drawing. And if we look at the edge of her robe and the way it swirls over her shoulders, or the rivulets of her hair, or even how the bodice on the front of her undergarment, it's not an undergarment, but the garment below, swirls, everything seems to flow as if it were water. I think this is kind of a fascinating thing about Leonardo's work. There are hundreds and hundreds of copies of this work. And the copies usually highlight for us what were Leonardo's strengths, because they tend to make things simpler and easier to identify. So this one's up in the Walters Museum in Baltimore, a 17th century copy after Leonardo, showing that even after the High Renaissance style had somewhat changed and gone somewhat out of style, people are still interested in Mona Lisa. But you'll notice the folds on the bolt of fabric that goes over her shoulder have none of the complexity of Leonardo's. The sfumato is a little heavy-handed in her body. Things just fade into darkness. The landscape is sort of cleaned up, and our artist attempts to get Leonardo's smoky light, but at the same time, it's nowhere near as effective or mysterious as it is in the hands of Leonardo. And then, of course, the face has a slightly more insipid look about it. This is a good copy. Nothing looks good when it's compared to Leonardo. Another thing that's interesting about this is the way he's cleaned up the setting as well. How Leonardo in the original has only given us the base of those columns. It's not been trimmed. We have the original edges of the panels, and we know it's never been trimmed. But he just sort of hints at the setting and hints at things, leaves them off the canvas so that you complete it in your mind. It works like the sfumato that way. And our copyist, well, he made it a little bit more easy to understand by giving us those columns on either side, very clearly depicted for us. As I mentioned, Leonardo kept this his entire life. In around 1512, 1515, Leonardo became another court painter. He moved to France and became the painter to the court of King Francis I. Francis I, we'll see many times over, he loved Italian art. He's almost single-handedly responsible for bringing the style of the Italian Renaissance into France. And he was really happy to get Leonardo to come and work for him. In fact, it was in in Francis I's court that Leonardo did that drawing of the lizard that we talked about in class. And Leonardo spent his last years there. He eventually died in France in 1519 and kept the Mona Lisa all the way until his death. And so if you ever wonder what is this work of Italian Renaissance art doing in the Louvre in Paris, the reason it's there is because Leonardo kept it, and when he died, it went into the collection of the French king, and since then has become part of the public collection in Paris. One of the nice things about taking an art history class with high-quality digital images is that you can actually see the Mona Lisa a whole lot better here, even on a screencast, than you can in person in the Louvre, where it's always a zoo.